Hey guys, it's Dani. Today we are going to talk about dividing orchids. I'm going to tell you what division is, what it's good for, and how to properly do it to have the greatest chances of success. I'm going to show you various examples of orchids that can be divided. We're also going to divide one of my dendrobium orchids. So I hope you will find this video useful, and if you do end up enjoying it, don't forget to give it a like. I would really appreciate it, and why not subscribe? I post new videos 3 times a week. Today's episode, along with our entire Orchid Care for Beginners series, is sponsored by repotme.com, who offers you everything you could possibly need to properly take care of your orchid, from media to fertilizer, pots, and all sorts of accessories. Some of the accessories that I will use in this care series and in today's video are provided by Repotme, so I will link you to their website down below in the description. Feel free to visit them at any time. So with that said, let's start by talking about what orchids we can divide. Division is mostly possible with sympodial orchids such as the oncidiums, cattleyas, dendrobiums, even paphiopedilums if they're bushy enough. All of these orchids which create pseudobulbs, canes, or even fans that are connected through a rhizome, they can be divided because division actually refers to the separation of these structures in order to obtain 2 or more sides which can live on their own. If you've watched our previous tutorials on cattleyas, oncidiums, and slipper orchids, which I'll link you to down below in case you missed them, you might already know that all of these orchids create pseudobulbs or canes or fans which are not separate plants. They're part of the very same plant, and they work together to keep the entirety of the orchid healthy. These structures create leaves, roots, and new growths of their own. So if we separate part of them, we can create a brand new orchid identical to the mother orchid. Division is generally not possible with monopodial orchids such as the Phalaenopsis because these structures don't create canes or pseudobulbs connected by a rhizome. They have a central axis that produces roots, leaves, and flower spikes. So in this case, dividing the top from the bottom of the orchid is not generally possible. It is not division, and you should definitely not do it if you're not knowledgeable enough. Phalaenopsis orchids can be propagated through keikis, which are baby plantlets, so we can divide those, but that's going to be a video for another time. What we are going to perform today is division of sympodial orchids. So the main reason for dividing our sympodial orchids is to propagate them, but it's not necessary. It is not a maintenance type of task that we need to do from time to time. If you don't want to divide your orchids, you don't have to, but there are instances in which we might consider it. So let's go through those instances right now. Reason number 1, you just want to have 2 or maybe more of the very same orchid. If you have an orchid that you absolutely love and you don't want to take any chances of actually losing it altogether, you might want to divide it into a few pieces that are standalone orchids in their own pots. This is particularly useful if you have a really rare or maybe very expensive orchid that you know you will have issues finding again. But of course, if you just want to propagate for the fun of it, that can be a good enough reason as well. But you don't necessarily need to keep both of the divisions. You can gift one away. So if you have a friend that would love to have an orchid that you have, you can definitely give them a division of your orchid and it will be an identical copy of your orchid. This is especially used when there is a unique type of orchid, maybe with special features that other individuals of the same species don't have. Starting with propagation through division and ending with more advanced types of cloning orchids, these traits will be passed on to that division as well. So you can imagine other types of settings where you might want to create multiple orchids with the very same type of unique variations. A reason that I usually have to divide orchids is to bushen them up. Now, this is a little bit of a different division because it doesn't imply me actually separating completely a part of the orchid, but rather cutting the rhizome and leaving that part still in the pot. Now, the reasoning for this is that sympodial orchids usually have a direction of growth, and you might have noticed this with oncidiums and other sympodials. Usually there is a part of the orchid which is active, which creates new growth, new roots, and of course flowers, And then there's the older part, which is not that active. And in many cases, that old part remains inactive pretty much forever. In order to wake it up and promote new growths, we can separate the newest part of the plant from the oldest part. And in this way, we create brand new growths on the old side of the orchid and pretty much bushen up the orchid. If the plant cooperates and if we perform the division correctly, which we will get to by the end of this video, we will end up with an orchid that has multiple directions of growth and pretty much grows evenly on all sides. Typically, the more new growths we have in directions of growth, the more flowers. So not only is the orchid looking a lot fuller and symmetrical, but it will also have more flowers. Sometimes orchids can grow pretty unruly, and division can actually help us rearrange the orchid in the pot and give it a more compact growth. And this is the case with my cucumber orchid, which we divided just a few days ago. I'll link you to the video down below in case you're not subscribed to my channel and you missed it. This orchid had a pretty linear growth and it was already spilling over the pot. So what I did was divide it into two sections and I placed them in the pot so that both of them will grow in opposite directions of the pot, pretty much filling it up on all sides. This technique is better suited for cattleyas and other orchids which have rather a linear growth without much on the sides. Not so much for oncidiums, but it really depends on the orchid. But definitely you can perform a division just to rearrange the orchid in the pot better and direct its roots in the pot rather than outside the pot. And lastly, division can actually be performed to eliminate some parts of the orchid. Maybe old parts that are really not looking all that great, or parts which are affected by something and are putting the entire orchid at risk. Making a correct division can actually improve the aesthetic of an orchid and even save it depending on the situation. So in my case, you can see that my orchid does have quite the unsightly old growths, but the newer growths look a lot better. I can definitely remove this section of the orchid. The very tiny pseudobulbs are seedling pseudobulbs. They are very old. They don't actually have roots anymore. So if I really wanted to, I could remove two of these pseudobulbs and let the orchid continue on with the newer pseudobulbs. In this case, we need to take into account the rules of division, but it's definitely perfectly fine to remove parts of the orchid which are just not helpful anymore. And of course, you might have other reasons for wanting to divide your orchids. But whatever the reason might be, division needs to follow a few rules in order to be successful and furthermore, not to actually do more damage than good. So let's talk about these rules now in order not to actually damage our orchid. So first off, if you want to divide an orchid in order to propagate it, you need to start with a perfectly healthy orchid. Your orchid needs to have plump pseudobulbs, it needs to have a good root system, a good leaf system, and overall just be healthy and established. Try to make sure that the divisions you will take will also have roots. This is especially helpful if you have an orchid with multiple directions of growth. Orchids which are dehydrated, stressed, maybe you just repotted them, maybe you purchased them at a discount and you're trying to save them, they are not good candidates for division. Also, if you cannot make sure that both divisions have active roots, then better wait for the orchid to grow more, produce more pseudobulbs, and perform a division when you will have two sections which are completely healthy. Rule number 2, each division should have at least 3 pseudobulbs that are connected to each other. In this way, we make sure that each division will have enough resources to create new growth and a new root system. So let's take my example here. Let's say that I would like to divide this orchid in half. I could totally do that because on each side I have actually more than 3 pseudobulbs. Have 1, 2, 3, and 4, and on this side I would have 1, 2, 3, and a new growth, which is not considered a pseudobulb since it isn't mature, but I do have 3 completely mature pseudobulbs. Pseudobulbs store water and nutrients, and they do feed the new growths until they produce new roots. So the more pseudobulbs a division has, the faster it will grow, the less setback you will have. Of course, it is possible to make divisions with only 2 pseudobulbs, and in some cases they can be successful, but it really depends on the type of orchid, how vigorous it is, Ideally, you want to have 3 pseudobulbs per division if at all possible. A little side note here, even though propagation of single pseudobulbs is possible, it is not always guaranteed to give results. This technique is called propagation through backbulbs, in which one of the older bulbs is completely separated from the rest of the plant, potted separately, and hopefully this will trigger it to produce a new growth. But this type of propagation is tricky because obviously the setback will be major. If the back bulb does not have roots, chances of success are really not very high. Just wanted to mention that this type of propagation exists. If you have a single pseudobulb that fell from the orchid, you can try and propagate it, but it's not as efficient as 3-bulb propagation. Also, don't try to propagate new growths which are not fully mature just yet. Chances of success are really small. These growths still depend on the mother pseudobulb for nutrients and water. Especially if the new growths have no roots, then chances are really close to 0. So don't separate new growths from the rest of the plant, because most often than not, it will end in disaster. And lastly, if you wanted to give a division to a friend, don't give the oldest part of the orchid, because chances are it will not develop anything, or if it will, it's going to be a struggle to actually bring it to maturity. If you have no choice and your friend agrees to it, you can definitely remove the oldest part of your orchid, but again, chances of this part actually sprouting and developing normally are pretty slim, particularly if the older part does not have roots. What can happen is a new growth can start, but the older pseudobulbs can actually deplete before that new growth creates roots. It's always fun to try and experiment, but don't assume that this side will create a brand new plant within a year. Now that we know the theory, let's put it into practice. I will divide my Dendrobium orchid because, as you can see, it has a pretty linear direction of growth, and I do believe I can make it a lot bushier, or at least a lot more symmetrical in its pattern of growth. So my reason for dividing this orchid is to bushen it up, not to create 2 separate plants, but I could definitely do that if I wanted to, because I have a lot of pseudobulbs to work with. Right now, this orchid is actually actively growing. It is producing new roots and new growths, so it is a good time to repot it, because usually division means repotting as well. So you need to keep in mind the rules of repotting as well. If your orchid is creating brand new roots and new growth, it is actively growing, then it's a good time to repot and also divide. So first off, I need to unpot my orchid. So just like I usually unpot all of my orchids, I will squeeze on the pot to remove the roots from the sides of the pot, and I will pull up, and here is my orchid. I will remove as much medium as I can from the root system because it's not very new and it could actually do with a refresh. Next, I'll try to cut away as many dead roots as I can see, just to make sure that the divisions that I will make will have roots. And my orchid does have a lot of roots. I don't have many dead roots, but here in the oldest section, I do see a few roots which are not alive anymore. If you see roots that seem to leave a string behind, those roots are not alive and you are safe to cut them. So I'll clean up my orchid really fast and come back when I'm done. So I cleaned up my orchid as best as possible, and now I need to decide where I want to divide it. Now, even though this orchid does have an older part, this old part is actually active. This is a pseudobulb that just bloomed, and I do have another direction of growth right here. So what I want to do is make sure that I do include that direction which I had growing last year, and I also have at least 3 pseudobulbs, which is not going to be a problem. So I think I want to divide my orchid right here. Now I need to cut directly into the rhizome, not the pseudobulb. So it is perfectly fine to try and separate a little bit your orchid. Sometimes if you pull on the orchid, it will split on its own, but sometimes it won't, and you will need a pair of pruners, which is very sharp, cuts very well, and you disinfected it if you worked with other orchids prior to dividing this orchid. So I do have my trusty fiskars here. Let me get you closer to show you exactly what it is that I need to cut. So what I want to cut is this little rhizome, which is a modified stem that connects both of these parts. I don't want to cut into the pseudobulbs, but right here into this connection. So with my fiskars, I'm gonna go right at this connection and give a clean cut. And there we have it. This is the rhizome of the orchid, and this is what you need to cut, not the base of the pseudobulb. So if I would cut right here, I would actually cut the base of these 3 pseudobulbs. So do be very, very careful and check twice or 3 times before you actually make the cut. Now the roots will be a little intertwined. If you jiggle a little bit the 2 sides, they will come right off, and you can actually see brand new roots growing from this side of the orchid, meaning it is active, and of course brand new roots from this side. I made sure to follow all of the division rules, so there is no reason why this division will not be successful. Alright, time to pot up my orchid. Now I could definitely reuse the pot because it definitely fits it back, but I'm not going to do so because this particular orchid tends to extend on a horizontal level rather than being a climber. So I'm going to go for a slotted repot me pot, which is wider than the initial pot, as you can see, and also it is not as tall. And my orchid doesn't actually have a tendency to create very deep roots. So this will be a little bit more suited for what I'm trying to create here, while it will also give plenty of ventilation and of course drainage to my orchid. So being that the goal was to make the orchid look more compact and even out the pattern of growth, what I will do is place my orchid with its active directions of growth opposite to each other, because I know that from this side the orchid will grow in this direction and from this side in the other direction. So up until now the orchid looked like this, but now I want it to grow like this. And already it looks a lot bushier simply by rearranging these 2 divisions. So I'll go ahead and place medium around them, making sure that I don't damage the root system. I'm gonna speed this up for you. And here we are, my orchid is divided and repotted. All I need to do is give it a good watering and we're all done. Now a few more words before we move on. First of all, the orchid I worked with naturally has these ridges in the pseudobulbs, so it wasn't dehydrated. In case you're not familiar with the Dendrobium jenkinsi or the aggregatum, they're very similar. Their pseudobulbs are naturally ridged. So I did make sure that my orchid was fully hydrated. And second, it was ideal for me that this section had a very active direction of growth. But even if it didn't have it, I would still be able to perform this division, because cutting of the rhizome actually stimulates new growth in the section that we cut. It would just take a little bit longer. As we saw, the division did have roots, so it would have been perfectly fine to divide it that way even if I didn't have an active direction of growth. So now that we're done with our division, let's take a few more examples and see where I should divide these orchids if I wanted to. So let's take the Cattleya we saw earlier. It is a naturally bushy plant, and if I wanted to, I could create multiple divisions. All I would need to do is make sure that I have at least 3 pseudobulbs per division. I can absolutely have more than 3 pseudobulbs. So this would be the newest pseudobulb, which is also in bloom. Let us count back. 1, 2, 3. So if I wanted to, I could make a division right here. But if I wanted to have multiple pseudobulbs, I could actually keep 4 pseudobulbs on this division and make the division right here. Just like in the case of the Dendrobium, I would need to cut right here where the rhizome is. Not here in the middle of the pseudobulb, but right here where a new pseudobulb connects to an old one. I am not going to divide this orchid. I have no reason to, but if I wanted to, that's where I would cut. On this orchid, we actually worked quite recently. It had a yellow wing pseudobulb, which was very, very old, and we had to remove it. And how I went about it again was to go right to the rhizome. I didn't cut into the pseudobulb or the base of the pseudobulb. In this case, it was very easy to see the rhizome because this particular orchid has pretty long rhizomes. So there are cases which are a little bit more obvious than others. And of course, there are cases which are not as easy, where the rhizome is very thin or very hard to see. What you can do in these instances is count the growths, whether they are fans or pseudobulbs. And when you counted at least 3, try to just pull the orchid apart with your hands and you will be able to see the rhizome and where you need to cut. As I was saying, sometimes just by pulling the orchid apart, the rhizome will snap, but this really depends on the orchid, and rather than damaging the orchid, better use the pruners to cut the rhizome. Just remember not to cut pseudobulbs. So that is about it on dividing orchids. I hope you've enjoyed today's video and I hope it will help you out. Thank you so much for watching, and thank you RepotMe for making this entire series possible. Subscribe to my channel for more orchid videos, tutorials, experiments, updates, and other fun orchid subjects. If you wish to support the channel, do consider becoming a member or visit the merch store linked down below in the description. You can also follow me on Instagram and Facebook. It's always nice to stay in touch there as well. And with that said, I'll see you guys next time. Bye!